The hand of God is a bigger hand than any one man. And if you take that symbolically to represent the ministry, the 5 offices of the ministry that are pictured by those 5 fingers of that hand, even if you take it that way, that's bigger than any one man. Unless you're talking about the man Christ Jesus. Jesus takes all those offices and wraps them up in one. All of them operating at their highest level. Even if you'd argue, and we have usually said this through the years, that an apostle, sometimes we talk about how it touches all the other fingers, but I can do that with my first finger too. But the thumb, or whatever, and that can use all the offices. I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's probably true. I say probably because I haven't seen it in its full operation in my lifetime. But I think it's probably true. An apostle would have the capability to operate in all those offices, but I don't think an apostle operates in all those offices at their peak, which means somebody could be a greater prophet, somebody could be a greater whatever, evangelist, even than an apostle. I don't think that means an apostle would be the supreme in all those areas. Though sometimes I think apostles have an area of excellence. They might have more than one, and maybe even that was the thing they started out with. If you look at somebody like the Apostle Paul, it looks like his probably initial area of excellence, just looking at his own resume he gave, was probably teaching. He sat under one of the greatest teachers of that day. You don't see that he was doing a lot evangelistically. You may not realize this, but the Jews weren't very evangelistic to begin with. They're still not. If you understand anything about Judaism, it's almost anti-evangelistic, as strange as that might sound. They've got a mindset like this is for us. So that's why we can't get that mindset ourselves. That's not the New Covenant Church's mindset. They've got this mindset like God's given us this calling. We're the children of Abraham. If he wants to add anyone else to this special calling that we have as this unique small group, he'll bring them to us. We don't need to go out and evangelize them. That's strange when you read through the Old Testament, all the statements God told them about how they would be ministers of the world. And somebody asked the question, it might have been Sister Claudia, Sister Olga, I think Brother Andy had some thoughts on it too, on being kings and priests, That role was promised to Israel first. He said that he was going to make them a kingdom of priests. That's where we get the initial statements that get feathered out into the role of kings and priests later. But that they would be a group of priests to the world. Well, that didn't mean every Israelite was a priest. I don't know if this is where anybody's questions are at on this. If you want to get into it, we can. But that helps you also understand something that's been highly misunderstood in general Christianity. And that is the belief that all believers are kings and priests. That is the belief of most Christian churches. That belief really took off, maybe more than at any other time during the Reformation, because of the priestly class of the Catholic Church, which was so elitist and so controlling over the laity that when they broke from that priestly class, one of the things they wanted to say is everybody's a priest. We don't need to listen to any of these priests anymore. Funny thing is, they immediately began to have ministers that were leaders, though, so they basically had the same thing, but they didn't want to call them priests, of course, and then they broke free of that, and they said, well, everybody's a king and a priest among the believers. On one level, that might be true. You might be surprised I'm saying that, but you notice I qualified it. On one level, that might be true, the level that is the same way he intended it for Israel. If Israel were to be a kingdom of priests, or perhaps what is meant by kings and priests, if that's what he intended for Israel, was every Israelite going to be serving as the king of Israel? Could anybody in Israel, like in the United States, as long as you're a citizen of the United States, I hope they don't change that, because we've got some absolute lunatics who have been elected to office, who were not born in this country, who are now elected to offices of things like being a mayor, I gave that away maybe, that are absolute lunatics. And according to our laws at this point, they cannot ever become president because you have to be a natural born citizen to be president. But could every Israelite be a king? Could any Israelite? God could just pick anyone, right? By the way, God's sovereign, so technically you might argue you could pick anyone, but once God sets the standard, he holds himself. He keeps his word, see? So if God says this is how it's going to be, this is the structure I want, something pretty dramatic would have to happen for him to change that structure. He set a structure in place. Who knows when it started, the structure of kings and priests? I actually have some other thoughts in my mind. I'm just feeding off of some questions that I got from some of you. So if you want to keep going this way, pull on it a little bit. Respond to me or ask a question. I'll keep moving this direction. But where did the first king, this is a trick question, but where did the first king over Israel appear in the Bible? Oh, I heard from, I think Brother Sheck said Moses. Technically, Moses was the first king, even though there's only really one clear passage that points that out. Talks about Moses and said he was a king in Jeshurun. Jeshurun. He was a king in Yeshurun. J's are usually pronounced as Y's in Hebrew. So he operated as a king. He wasn't crowned as a king. There's no record that he was anointed as a king. He wasn't even anointed as a priest. He's the one that anointed the priest, though, which is pretty telling, wouldn't you say? That's a pretty high office you must have if you can anoint somebody to be a priest. And not just any priest. He started the whole line of the priests. So where did the priestly line start? Aaron. So Aaron and how many sons did he have? How many sons did Aaron have? 4. So how many priests would that give us initially? 5. Does that seem significant? Isn't that same number as the offices of the ministry? Isn't that interesting? God works in patterns. So there's an example of a pattern. That number 5 has to have some ministerial significance. Had somebody say to me one time at 5 and the hand and the 5 fingers, forgive me if I'm being repetitive, maybe you've heard me say it a few times, but there's actually not 5 offices was the argument they said to me. There's actually just 4, because the last office, we might have talked about this here just lately, there's a different form of the word "and" there that seems to combine the pastor and teacher. So their argument was there's apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastor teachers. If you're seeing my fingers, there'd be 4 instead of 5. The only problem I have with that is not that it contradicts the idea of the hand representing the ministry and the hand coming up out of the sea and all those other beautiful pictures, but we see a 5-fold ministry in the very beginning when the first ministry was established, don't we? We see 5 men that were the very first ministers, so there's a pretty good baseline for why we might start building and looking at things like the number 5 in the Bible and see, does it fit in to some of these? You'd have to be a scholar if you know this, all right? How many men are described in the Song of Solomon as being around Solomon's bed and his chariot, his palanquin, which is one of those things they lift you up on and carry you? How many great warriors were around that described in the Song of Solomon? Anybody know? 60 mighty men around there. And if you take 60, you divide it 5 times 12. 12 is the number of government in the Bible. 5 is, I think, in part, it's a number for the ministry. It can represent other things. People say it represents grace. There's some other things. 5 times 12, so the ministry and government. So you can see how you can start feathering things out and finding some types and shadows. That isn't a type or a shadow. That's structural symbolism. You can find structural symbolism, types, shadows, other things like that. So the first priests were Aaron and his sons, Eleazar, Ithamar, Nadab, and Abihu. All of them did not succeed, unfortunately. Nadab and Abihu, as you know, made a mess of themselves and did something, which we could talk about that too. We'll let that float out there. We get into that verse. See, what in the world were they up to that they were offering strange fire? You could probably make a whole list of things they might have been doing that God was offended by. That'd be a whole Bible study we could have just talking about strange fire. But it started out with those 5 men that Moses had so great of a position with God that he was able to actually anoint those men to be priests, which means he had to have a higher position in terms of the religious economy of God than even they had. Even as priests, he was in a higher position. Again, there's no formal anointing of him as king, but there is that little statement about how he was a king in Jeshurun, and that lets you know he was working as a king. It looks like the first time God formally named somebody a king, in fact, it doesn't look like, it is. First time God formally named someone a king was obviously Saul, the tribe of Benjamin. And this might trouble you, I don't know, maybe it shouldn't trouble you, but that never was going to be the kingly line. You know that when God set up Saul as king, he already knew ahead of time his line was not going to continue in that position. I don't mean that he made Saul fall into some mess. I don't believe that happened. I think Saul made his own choices. But I think God knew enough about that family line, and that'd get into very complicated arguments, but I think God knew the direction of it. That family line was not going to be the kings of Israel. Why do you think I'm making that argument? Oh, Andy Shex is on the ball tonight, I'm telling you. Genesis 49, it said, is it the 10th verse? Read it out.
The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall be the gathering of the people.
So a scepter won't depart from Judah. Now, I think that's interesting because Judah never had a scepter, so I'm sure when his father was praying this blessing over him, he was going through, you realize, in some of these passages, the blessings on his sons. They're not all blessings. Some of them were rebukes. The first 3 sons were not exactly pleasant statements. Reuben, unstable as water, committed a pretty serious crime against his father. And then who knows what Simeon and Levi did? Yeah, they murdered somebody. In fact, they murdered a whole lot more than somebody. Here was the problem. They did not use retributive justice in a truly just way. Maybe the man who assaulted their sister might have been worthy of death, but they made sure every man in the city got killed. They killed every man in the entire city because of what one man had done. And so he talked about them. I think the description of them is that they were instruments of cruelty. Isn't that what it says about them? Now, what he's doing and going down through these blessings, and maybe they're blessings and cursings in there, what he's going down through these is he's actually letting you know why God, not that God didn't already know this was going to happen, but how God was going to go right down through the line and choose another person to represent the firstborn of the tribes. Because Reuben had committed this immoral sin, Reuben was disqualified. Then Simeon and Levi committed this sin of injustice, cruelty, mass murder of a bunch of people that probably had no idea what Shechem's son had done, and they killed them all as part of their vengeance on what Shechem's son had done. So those two were disqualified. Who's next in the 12 tribes? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Now we're to Judah. So now he's giving his prayer over Judah that Brother Shex just read. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. What scepter? Scepter is something a king has, isn't it? It's an instrument that demonstrates his authority, his power. Like you see the scepter being held out over Esther or anyone else that would come before those great kings of Persia and Babylon. They'd have their scepter, a rod of some kind they'd hold out to let you know you can approach them or let you know stay back. Or it was a way of demonstrating their authority. The pharaohs had the same thing. If you look at the images of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, they carried their version of a scepter too. So he said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. That's interesting because Judah didn't have a scepter to depart from him, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, which, by the way, doesn't mean there'll be someone sitting on the steps. It's talking about the fact you have a little boy. So you'll continue to have children that will be inheriting this authority. He'll continue to produce children that would be between his feet, so to speak, his little ones, that would hold that level of authority. Until Shiloh comes. Shiloh, I think, or Shiloh in Hebrew, I think is a prophetic name for Jesus. So until Jesus came, Judah would be the one with the scepter, the one who would give the laws. Now, he wasn't talking about religious laws. Those were all given on Mount Sinai by Moses. He was talking about the civil laws. Now, there's a fine line between civil and religious laws in ancient Israel because they all were just the law. Some were civil, some were religious, but Judah would be the one responsible for enforcing the law. Not giving it in the sense of a lawgiver like Moses, but they would give the judgment of the law. So Judah was promised to be a kingly line. Now there's a reason I'm giving all this backstory. Could anybody in Israel, once the kingly line was truly set up, it wasn't set up, as you know, till David. There was this temporary allowance of Saul, and the reason for the temporary allowance of Saul from probably one of the worst tribes of all the 12 tribes. There are some examples you might give of some of the things this tribe did in the Old Testament that may not even be good for mixed company to be talking about in the book of Judges. You know, Benjamin did some of the worst acts of any tribe. They were brutal. They were major idolaters. And when you get down to the list of the 12 tribes that are listed in the 7th chapter of Revelation, Benjamin's not in there. And maybe it's because of just how bad what they did was that God's not going to let that tribe have a place. But you want to know what's astonishing? One of the greatest men of God that's ever walked this earth was from the tribe of Benjamin. Who was that? Apostle Paul. That gives you an insight into the mercy of God. There's one of the things we were singing about. Count his mercies. Count them and be blessed. I'm going to tell you, you'll be blessed, you count them. You start counting up the mercies God's given you, and just his acts of mercy would cause you to be blessed, not just in the sense that you would feel better, but it would change your state of mind maybe about God, realizing that he has acted in mercy times he had no necessity to do it. First of all, he can do anything he wants. But I mean, there was no legal reason for him to be merciful. There was no legal standing that would say, you really do need to be merciful. You told people if they do A, B, and C, you'll be merciful. It wasn't that kind of situation. There was no reason to be merciful, and he was merciful. Paul was such an incredible example, but the tribe of Benjamin as a whole was a mess. What if once Saul was gone and God anointed David, he anointed him in the same kind of way that he anointed Saul, of course, but also how he had used Moses to anoint Aaron and his sons. He anointed him with oil by someone who was a prophet. That prophet had the level of authority necessary to anoint him. And so now once David is king, could anybody in Israel be king? I mean legally. Maybe somebody could try to kill David and take the throne, but I mean legally in God's eyes. Could anybody from any tribe be king? Could anybody from any tribe be a priest after Aaron and his sons were set up as priests? And God made it clear that the priests have to come not just from the tribe of Levi, but from the line of Aaron. Because you had all those Levites that were assistants. They were ministers, but they weren't at the level of the priests. Only Aaron's line could be priests. There were times people tried to set up other priests, but that was against the order of God. So Aaron's children were priests from that point on. David's line were the kings. And yet God had told all Israel there to be a kingdom of priests, didn't he? Now, I said all that to get to this simple point that God can even potentially, someone might pull out the first chapter of Revelation and try to make this argument, for example, where it talks about how you're kings and priests. The problem is that could be talking to the whole church. It could just be talking to John and the other people who the Lord was talking to who were overcomers, because John was the one who Jesus and the angel, Jesus started out, and then he revealed that revelation through his angel. And then you seem to see an angel going with John throughout the rest of the book, which some people get to a certain point. This would be another whole Bible study. Some people get to a certain point in the book where the angel is saying some things that sound a little mysterious, and they say, bless the Lord. That's not a celestial angel. That's a human being that went to heaven after he died. And he's up there before John even died, so sometime in the first century. The only reason someone would come up with that idea is because of the way the Greek is translated in the King James Version makes it sound like the angel is saying, I'm one of your brethren. That's not what the Greek actually says. He's talking to John. He says, I am a servant of God like you and your brethren. He isn't saying, and I'm one of your brethren. So he's actually making a contrast between himself and those two passages in the latter part of the book of Revelation. He's not saying, I'm one of your brethren. He's saying, like you and your brethren, if you were reading in the Greek. That'll push some buttons I didn't plan on pushing outside of this assembly, but I do not believe that's talking about a human being. Otherwise, why would you say what you're saying? Why would you talk about other people as you and your brethren? You'd be one of them, wouldn't you? If he was one of the overcomers, which is what some people believe. But I think he was an angel like he was all through the book of Revelation. Jesus had a celestial angel taking John on a tour of the future. Isn't that a strange thing to think about? Some of it was a tour of heaven. The 4th, 5th chapters of Revelation, he gets a real insight into the throne room of God. And then it begins immediately to go into many symbolic things that are a tour of the future. Up to that point, it was a lot of things that were going on in the present, the first few chapters of Revelation. Once you get into the 6th chapter of Revelation, I believe it's starting to move forward in time. I don't mean that all of that's forward in time from us. It was forward in time from John. You can see later in Revelation, the 17th chapter, he's explaining the nature of this system that's going to come on. He talks about how there was an empire, a kingdom, a beastly power that was and that is and that's one to come. And the one that John was living in made it very clear where John was at in terms of chronological prophetic time period. All right, now I pulled a whole bunch of threads, so any of those you're interested in, pull back. Pull the other end of it. But kings and priests, I think there's several levels, the way that language is used in the Bible. On one level, Israel were called to be a ministry to this world. They weren't called to wait around for people to show up like they later turned into, where they stopped proselytizing. There obviously were some still proselytizing, though, because Jesus said you compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and you make him twofold more a child of hell. Worse than yourselves, because he could have had a chance, but now you bound him into some false religious idea that he thinks he's fine. Maybe before he knew he wasn't fine. Now you got him convinced he is fine, so why would he go looking for anything else? That's why he's twofold more a child of hell. He was already a child of hell, but he had the sense to recognize, I'm a child of hell. Hell, by the way, just talking about judgment. I'm under judgment. But then you tell him, if you believe like we do, you won't be under judgment. And you convince him of it, but he's still under judgment, and so he's twofold more, which means in some ways it's worse because now he doesn't even recognize he needs help. That's the problem with a lot of the Christian world. They don't realize there's something more. One of the things that is very important for us to do, I don't do it real hard, and I certainly try my best not to do it in a condescending tone or in an arrogant spirit, the very thing I've been talking so much against on some of our Wednesday nights. But there is a distinction between what God has given us. And we have to be careful not to lose that distinction because every generation is going to look and say, well, there's wonderful things. There are. That's why I try to make it a little more feathered out than sometimes the way some word it. I don't think everything outside our walls is Babylon. Babylon is out there, but I think there's a no man's land between us and Babylon where there's a lot of things. But even among those things that are outside of our walls, there's good people. What we are dealing with in our day-to-day that's very dangerous, you see this in the political realm, is that we are getting to the point where there has been so much sympathy that became empathy for evil. Sympathy is when you feel for somebody. Maybe you think they're a mess, but you feel for them. Like, I'm sorry they're in that situation. If you're going to simplify it, empathy is to feel with. It literally means to feel with, which means I'm sharing your feeling. You can't share the feeling of the wicked. That's what this world wants us to do. They label it things like tolerance, when what they really mean is you need to share in my feeling. Well, if I share in your feeling, you're angry about God, I have to be angry about God to share in that feeling, don't I? I might be sympathetic to you because maybe the reason you're angry with God is because you lost somebody you loved and it tore your heart out. I can sympathize with that. I've been in times in my life where I didn't understand what God was doing. People I've lost, blows that I took. And maybe there's been times that, and I think I was when I was out of church, that I was angry with God. I looked at things going on that hurt me. I saw things happen that broke my heart. I am certain I was angry at God. I might not have thought about it consciously like that, Heath. I might have just been thinking, I just want to go sow my wild oats, do my own thing. But I think down in my heart, I wouldn't have left Him if I wasn't angry at Him. If I had thought God's real and He loves me and He wants to be in a relationship with me, I don't think I would have been pulled so heavily. But I think I was angry at things I saw that I felt like, you let this happen, Lord. Why would you let this happen? Why would you let leaders do this or let these things occur? And you can get angry with God because He doesn't answer your prayers or because He allows things to happen that you don't understand. And I can sympathize, see, not empathize. I can sympathize with that. I can look at a person and say, I understand why they feel that way. And I feel sorry for them that they feel that way. I don't want to feel the same way they do, though. That's when empathy becomes an extremely dangerous thing. I've been reading a book here. In fact, I'm pretty much done with it. I'm just skimming through it. The last part of it is not as interesting to me as the first part was. The first part was dead on. The last part's starting to get a little shaky, and I don't know if it's going to stay shaky, so I started on another. I'm usually reading about 4 or 5 books at one time, at least, and studying a lot more than that. But it's called The Sin of Empathy. Maybe that's why empathy is on my mind. And they did a fantastic job in the beginning of showing why that's a dangerous thing. Sympathy is a good thing. Compassion, if it's the right kind of compassion, is a very important thing that we not lose. But I can be compassionate for somebody without sharing in their feeling. The mentality of our present world is you have to share in my feeling to really be compassionate, really be caring. You have to share. Oh, I'm not going to share. I'm not going to share in the feeling of the wicked. I do have a sympathy for their condition. I have a sympathy for their blindness because sometimes it's just pure blindness. They cannot see God and they cannot see themselves. And if you cannot see yourself and you cannot see God, you cannot be saved because you have to see yourself to recognize you need to repent. You have to see God to realize there's someone that will help you if you will repent. It wouldn't do you any good to recognize you're a mess and say, I'm so sorry I'm a mess. There was nobody that could help you. You're just talking to the air, wouldn't you? You just recognize you're a mess. The 2 first stepping stones, 2 first stair steps, whatever you want to call them, of the gospel are you have to recognize who you are and you have to recognize who He is. So you've got to realize I need help. I am in dire need of help. I need someone to save me out of this mess I'm in. I don't want to feel like I feel. I don't want to think like I think. I don't want to do the things I've done. But I can't do this by myself. I need help. And then you meet the man that can help you. Or in the case of Jesus, God's not a man, not in the sense we think of a man. He's talked about masculine terms, and I think in His deepest reality, He's masculine. There's a lot of people who are trying to gender neutralize. I said that intentionally, Larry. I realize it's not good grammar. They're trying to gender neutralize the Bible, making it gender neutral. That might be better grammar. They're trying to make the Bible gender neutral. You know, God's just as much a female as He is. No. You notice it's not God the mother, it's God the Father. It's not Jesus Christ the daughter, it's Jesus Christ the Son, isn't it? So you have to keep things as God describes them. You don't get to reinvent them to fit your ideas about things. But going back to this issue of empathy, you can get so empathetic, so sharing in the feelings of somebody regarding something that's evil, that you end up creating the wrong feelings towards the good, because eventually if you share in the feelings of the evil, your feelings towards the good will be changed. So sometimes I list some of these words that all end in pathy, because that refers to a feeling. Pathos is a feeling. It comes from the Greek. So sympathy is having a feeling towards somebody. Empathy is having a feeling with somebody. If you have a feeling with the wicked, you start sharing in their feelings, you'll start to develop apathy about the things of God. In other words, you'll lose your feeling. When you put the word a in front of a Greek word, it's like none or no. So when you say amillennial, Brother Lord was talking about that a little bit in our minister session. He mentioned amillennialism. That just means someone that doesn't believe there's a millennial reign. So apathy, you lose your feeling towards God, I mean. And then eventually, if you lose your feeling towards God while you're simultaneously getting your feelings more and more stirred towards the world, more and more engaged with the world, more and more on the side of the world, you'll end up getting another kind of pathy. You'll get antipathy. Antipathy, it's pronounced antipathy. That means against feeling. You've got a negative feeling now. You've got a feeling against God. If you really want to get confused or maybe more technical, I'm going to tell you where that'll lead. It's what we're seeing in our society right now. It'll lead to sociopathy or psychopathy. A sociopath or a psychopath. You get to the point where you hate God, you'll eventually become a sociopath, spiritually speaking. Most sociopaths, the type of qualities that they have very poor people skills, really hard for them to relate, but they get caught up in emotional things. And I'm very seriously simplifying this. This is just the majority of how it works. They get caught up in movements, people, personalities, wanting to be a part of a group, but they don't know how to engage, so they get worked up in their emotions easily. It sounds like a lot of the people running around the streets that you see on the news. Maybe you didn't realize we're watching a bunch of sociopaths. That's what they basically are. They've been turned into a bunch of lunatics by somebody that knows how to turn the key in the mind of a person like that, who's not got enough intelligence. And really, it comes down to not just intelligence in terms of IQ. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about knowledge and emotional intelligence. They don't have enough knowledge, and then they don't have enough emotional intelligence until they're being manipulated, that they're only being used. And eventually, somebody could become beyond that, where you lose all feeling, and you become so cunning and manipulative and hateful in your spirit, you might as well be a psychopath. That's what they're like. Destructive behavior, and they've lost all feeling. It means nothing to hurt people. Doesn't have any bearing on them at all. They feel nothing when they cause terrible injury and damage. We're full of a world full of sociopaths and psychopaths, you know. And the main reason this world's full of so many sociopaths and psychopaths is because they have not learned to have their feelings opened up to the God of heaven. They're at war with God. They're anti-God. They're against God and God's will. Part of why we need kings and priests in the earth. Somebody to introduce them to God. But it's got to be somebody with a level of authority that can operate in the spiritual realm with both a kingly role and a priestly role.